Well, welcome to the podcast. A little homage to our friend, Mr. Newman, formerly Power and Politics. Kevin, we have an exciting topic today, taxation. The topic everybody is afraid of around, just around this time of year as we pay our bills, but the one that nobody wants to talk about when it comes to reform or changes. All we hear about is that they're too high and we want to spend less. Well, we kind of work through the budgeting consequences of taxation and competitiveness and all that. There's a lot more under the hood, right?
There is, yeah. And in budgets, often, people like you and I, as former budget officers, we tend to think about these big issues of fiscal sustainability. Do we have enough revenues to fund the current suite of public services? Business people, investors, they think about competitiveness. They want to know, it's about like winning in a business, a business context. But sustainability is about the resilience. So it's a complicated conversation, and the discussions about tax design, they involve so many different dimensions: economic structure, public services, the kind of social contract that we have with Canadians. We're getting tax design decisions taking place, budgets and updates.
So it's kind of it's hard to talk about competitiveness, the trade issues, budget deficits without talking about taxation. So we brought together a couple of experts that we have a great deal of respect for, Scott Pattison and Heather Schofield. And I wonder if maybe this is an opportunity for us to kind of say, you know what, it is going to cost us money to reach some of the policy objectives that Canada set for itself while maintaining kind of a sustainable fiscal track. And that discussion, I think people are willing to have, has to go through taxation.
Yeah. And so, as you alluded to, we've got two great guests. Often on the show, we talk about getting underneath the hood. So in tax competitiveness, often we end up talking about how do we relate to other OECD countries, but particularly the United States. So who better to have than Scott, Mr. Scott Pattison, currently Director of Tax Research and Policy at the Federation of Tax Administrators. You and I have known Scott for many years when he was the CEO of the U.S. Governors Association. So this is somebody that's been in the White House, and we're also proud to call Scott a senior fellow at IFSD. So he brings an enormous amount of expertise at the state budgeting level, which is really critical when we try to compare tax systems, Canada and the United States.
So in the discussion, I think Scott, as you'll see, Scott was very frank about the U.S.-Canada comparison. And as a former budget officer, he was really clear about what are you really trying to aim for in terms of performance? And then really the tax system, like the fiscal system, has to really support it. And we talked about the competition among states for capital and ultimately between countries. And Canada's not immune from that. Without further ado, here's our discussion with Scott Pattison. Scott, thanks for being here. This has been, one of your many trips to Ottawa and different roles at national associations in the U.S. focus really on state level and some of how that state level picture kind of rolls up to a national picture. You've seen the evolution over the last decade of the U.S.-Canada relationship through 3 different presidencies, or 4 in particular. And I want to talk about maybe your observations of how that relationship has evolved since the first Trump administration to the Biden administration, now back to a second Trump administration, and what you're seeing in that dynamic evolve and how Canadians should view the evolution of the American kind of political system through the lens of its events and through your observations of how it kind of manifests in state level politics.
Well, we really are in a transformative period. There's no question. And I think what's important for Canadians as they look at what's going on in the United States, particularly from a political standpoint, is that the future is extremely uncertain and very unpredictable. And I think what's important about that is to realize that that requires the ability to be agile and adept at adapting to fairly quick changes. And that's critically important because I think it's just really hard to predict the administration, the level of tariffs, how even in a year or 2 from now, the president as well as other officials will deal with not only tariffs, but the relationship with Canada. I could see things changing. It's really hard to predict. The difference between the first Trump term and this current term is definitely there were a lot more constraints, whether they were self-imposed or imposed in other ways, that do not exist. And the current president is very comfortable making changes to policy very quickly. It might be a tariff rate on Canada, it might be something else. But there are also many examples of changing quickly from what was proposed or imposed. And so I think, unfortunately, and a lot of businesses and certainly other countries like predictability and certainty. It's not there right now. And I think just being aware of that is critically important.
And, I'll get to how Canada potentially takes advantage of some of that uncertainty for its own, to kind of drive its own economic strategy. But I also want to talk about, this uncertainty and actually the trade strategy that the Trump administration is using. And there are some clear kind of fiscal tax implications for the United States. Like that tariff revenue is a source of funds, right? And it's become a meaningful one. How has that kind of played into the strategy, the fiscal strategy of the federal government, state governments, through the lens of not just budgeting, but through taxation?
The way the administration is using tariffs is clearly leverage to try to get to certain results in negotiations and get certain agreements. I think the administration likes having the additional revenue, but I don't think that's as critically important. It's a very small percentage of the deficit. It's not going to solve any debt problems for the United States. And the U.S. still has the ability to borrow quite a bit of money. So if you got rid of all that, and of course the Supreme Court decision will have some impact
Right.
on at least decreasing the amount of tariff revenue coming in, that to me is not as important as the use of the tariffs really for leverage.
Let's get into leverage. You work at the state level. Clearly, there is a push to try to reshore jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, into those red states. And walk me through why that's so important, not just politically, but for the state economies.
Well, for actually the last few decades, one of the most important priorities of states, in particular governors, has been economic development. It's just been critically important, red and blue states. They desperately want business investment. They desperately want job creation. So that's been a real focus. And one thing I think that's particularly interesting about that is that really transcends the federal government policy. It transcends the party in power at the federal level. That's just really the focus. And of course, there's been a real political push, and it's particularly being seen in a lot of folks who voted for Trump, is a desire to get a lot more manufacturing jobs back in the United States. We haven't seen that. And I think there's an open question. A lot of economists are going to analyze whether that's going to happen. But that's a bit slower process.
Scott, I think Canadians might be surprised that there's a particular fiscal dynamic at the state level that might start to explain some of the behavior. Most states have balanced budget requirements that are embedded in their constitution. Is that right?
Yes, it's very interesting. And a lot of people aren't quite aware, even in the United States, that states are very different than the federal government and that they are subnational entities and they don't have anywhere near the economic control that a national government has. They can't control interest rates. They don't have their own currency. There are just many reasons that they're in a different economic situation. And as a result, they are very, very focused on economic development for their particular state. They're very focused on job creation. That's usually one of the most top priorities of any governor at the state level. What's also interesting is outside of borrowing for capital, infrastructure in particular, there's not a market for states being able to deficit fund. And in every case but Vermont, the constitution of a state basically prohibits deficit spending outside of borrowing for capital or sometimes cash flow needs.
So to maintain kind of this fiscal policy, it becomes more obvious as to why there's such a drive for economic development and why trying to reshore these manufacturing jobs ends up being absolutely critical for these states. And tell me what it's like for these states that have these balanced budgets and how trying to desperately kind of lower taxes to attract investment. How does that kind of play out in terms of, cost, quality of life, cost of living? Because I think Canadians have seen a lot of comparisons between, GDP per capita in Canada versus Alabama, Kansas, others. And on its surface, it looks like Canada's really fallen behind. I wonder how this plays out on the ground in those states and your observations of how these fiscal constraints and the economic strategies kind of plays out at a family level, a household level, and quality of life level.
Well, certainly. In fact, it's really interesting. I would say don't look at state GDP figures. I don't think they're very good measurements of what's going on at state level. I think they're better at giving you macroeconomic information for the nation. And so I'd start with that. If you're going to compare a country like Canada to a particular state, I would look at things like median household income. Also, it's really important to think about things like life expectancy and other quality of life factors. That really is what you should be comparing rather than the GDP figure, which is really a macroeconomic figure that I think gives you a better feel for what's going on at the national level.
There's also to kind of meet those objectives of job growth, attracting investment. States also appear to be, more aggressive on tax policy, right? Lowering state taxes. How does that play out in the short run? And what's your kind of perspective? How sustainable is that in the long run as a strategy to attract business, to attract talent?
It's in our DNA that we really hate taxes.
I
know
that. I heard that.
people
That makes a
do
lot of sense.
almost
Yeah.
everywhere, but we had a revolution in part over imposed taxation from England. And so you start with that. But what's going on, particularly at the state level, is there is a competitive situation. So even fairly democratic blue states they have a bit of a constraint as to how high taxes they will go. And what's really particularly interesting, the last few years, you saw almost every state do tax cuts. A lot of people think that's really a big deal at the Republican side. It's not. You saw tons of tax cuts in places like New York, Illinois. So you're seeing things like that. It's critically important to look at the entire tax burden that residents have in a particular state. That's often overlooked. There's usually a belief that things are better and the tax burden is lower in a state without an income tax. That's not necessarily true. When you look at things like the tolls that are paid, property taxes, sales taxes, other fees and local taxes, you could have a tax burden in what you think is a low tax state equal to what people perceive as a high tax state. So that's really important. The other thing that I think is important is there is, particularly for a lot of Republican and red states, there's a very strong belief among legislators and governors right now that they're going to attract economic development and it's better for the state to lower taxes, particularly income taxes and corporate income taxes as much as possible. I think we're going to see over the next few years how effective that is, because there's also the other side of the coin that's not always talked about. Taxes obviously pay for schools, roads, things that residents want, but frankly also businesses want and they need. They want to see, a business wants to see investment in a community college that might be doing training that provides the skills that the employers want and the type of people they want to hire. Also, I'll throw out the example of Kansas. Kansas did an extremely, very dramatic tax cut. They did not see the economic development they expected. And frankly, a lot of the voters and residents became upset because they saw cuts to things like K through 12 education, and they didn't like that. So to me, it's a balance. It's not, there's no really right answer to how much taxation you should have. You really have to figure out, how do we balance so we're competitive, but that we're still providing the minimal services that we think our state needs to also be competitive to attract business and jobs.
So for attracting businesses, we're also trying to attract talent. And, use the example of Kansas. Um, I imagine that the condition of K to 12 education, community college, universities, weighs on the mind of white collar talent, all kinds of talent trying to move to the state and have to consider what does this mean for their families, and are they now enrolling in private school, and do I start to lose the advantage of a low tax jurisdiction to try to get that quality of life? You're at these state level meetings. Is this discussed uh, as actually a barrier to actually getting some of the talent and the jobs you want in a state?
It can be. I've certainly participated in discussions with business leaders, and they've made it very clear that taxes can be an important factor, but it's not the only factor. They look at quality of life. They look at who they can employ, because you're right, they want certain skills. And I think what's really critically important too is to realize that there's kind of the whole package. One thing that's really important to business is not necessarily tax rates or what, say, the sales tax may be in a particular state. What they're going to care about is if they're doing particular economic investment, their particular business, are they getting a break? Is their type of investment providing either tax credits or some type of tax exemption? That's even more important than what at the macro level is for all the residents of the state as to what kind of taxes they pay.
But doesn't that now start to push into the political realm? The governor now has to start to pick favorites. Which industry do I favor? Who gets what tax breaks? And at what point does that start to become its own issue within the jurisdiction?
It's interesting because it's so common now that pretty much every state tries to attract business investment by providing types of tax credits or tax exemptions or tax deferral for businesses. I think it's become the norm. And you don't really see that much of a pushback as I think you would expect.
Unless you're trying to finance an NFL football stadium.
Yeah, that's true.
That we've seen pushback.
Yeah. Well, I do have to say, this is one of those things I find fascinating that you see in states and localities, and you've seen it for decades. Pretty much every economic study demonstrates that subsidies for a stadium do not have a return on investment for the particular state or locality, but it doesn't seem to matter. There are other considerations in politics where subsidies take place.
And I'm probably, I was highlighting probably the exceptions to the rule, because I think by and large, the tax increases go through and the stadiums get built, and people seem happy.
Yeah.
We've also seen, though, that there are limits. Like we've seen California to impose a wealth tax, and we see, at least in the headlines, wealthy industrialist investors start to leave the state. And right now it's a trickle and it makes the headlines. What is that? Like, what's driving the behavior at the state level for wealth taxes? And how much of a problem is it for those states that are now trying to deal with intergenerational equity issues this way?
I think what you're going to see is, and it's actually a good thing, is competition based on that. I think you're already seeing quite a bit of discussion about California having a high tax burden, particularly for the wealthy. I think time will tell. How much does that hurt the state? Certainly some people are going to move because of tax burden issues, and people do make decisions based on taxation. There are people that might go to a Florida because it has no income tax versus a North Carolina, which does, when they're making retiring decisions. Not always. The economic studies, the data, they're not really clear as to how significant the impact of certain tax increases and wealth taxes are on causing people to move. Again, I think it's hard to say, but certainly some people likely do.
So, turning back, maybe full circle back to Canada, you've been clear that we're in for a period of prolonged uncertainty. So if anybody here thought this was going to be temporary, we're going to get over it, you painted a picture that this uncertainty may go even beyond the Trump presidency. But your sense, maybe your guess as to how do the institutions react after this last Trump term is over? I'm presuming last Trump term because, there's some rumblings it might not be, but let's assume for a second it is. How do the parties, from your perspective, what you've seen, what steps do they take as political entities, as institutions after the Trump presidency, and what return to normalcy, if any, do you project after 3 years?
I think that's such a great question because I think right now in the United States, we're in this incredibly interesting transformative period that will last several years. Both parties are going to, I think they're going to be changing based on what kind of policies they push, because certainly the Republican Party has become much more populist and is very different from the very free market, free trade oriented Republican Party of 30, 40 years ago. But I think part of it is, and this is the most important part, I think the American people are still working out how much government they want, and therefore how much level of taxation and government intervention they want. I think that's up in the air. If you go back to the year 2000, the presidential races are relatively close. You really see a 50-50 nation, and you continue to see it. Someone wins, someone loses, but you're not seeing the landslides that as a kid, I remember LBJ, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. These were huge landslides. You don't see those. And I think, so what you're going to have is you're going to have to watch how does the leadership of the Democratic and the Republican parties change, and what kind of policies do they push, and what types of policies do their voters expect them to push. I think you could see some real significant changes. I think there are certain types of policies that voters who've been very supportive of Trump, but frankly, some voters who supported more liberals may be very interested in.
But then if you're a Canadian, you don't have a party of free trade now to count on in Washington anymore. And to what extent have, pro-free traders been successful in connecting tariffs to taxation? Is that a little wedge issue here to connect individual citizens and their families to what's being done at a political level to gain that leverage, use tariff for leverage? Are people starting to think about it in tax terms?
What I continue to hear is from political analysts, like Charlie Cook's a good example. He's a well-known political analyst in the U.S., and he recently said that he was surprised how quickly the American public made the jump from tariffs are taxes. And I think you're starting to see that. You're starting to see it in the polls. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think it will create somewhat of a political constraint over time, over the next few years, and certainly post-Trump, as to how much the American people are comfortable with tariffs. I don't think you're going to see major tariff increases. The effective tariff rate, I think, is going to be interesting over the next few years. My personal prediction would be that it may not go back to where it was prior to January of 2025, but I think it will be an effective rate that's lower.
And your point earlier was that it's not really a source of funds. It's a point of leverage for the government, right? For jobs and that particular economic agenda.
Mainly because it's just not enough to solve a particular problem. What I mean by that is it certainly is additional revenue for the U.S. Treasury, but it's not enough to make a huge dent in U.S. debt. It's not enough to fund a major program. It's certainly significant. I don't want to take that away, but it's just not enough to make a significant difference that would justify a strong political support.
So beyond kind of the political anxiety that's kind of defined the American landscape over the last, at least the last decade, if not longer, you've got this kind of economic anxiety that's been layered on top. You've got states now competing aggressively through taxation. You've got a federal government that's actually actively trying to move jobs, industrial jobs. And often, we see the Commerce Secretary talk about Canadian jobs getting reshored to the United States and auto jobs. So how does Canada respond? You've kind of painted a short-term picture of this uncertainty, but when I ask you to kind of go beyond the Trump presidency, you're still kind of painting a picture of uncertainty on an ongoing basis, right? And nothing settling down politically or institutionally. So how does Canada play this?
I think it's difficult, but any country is going to have to do what is in the interest of the country and the residents of that particular country. One thing I would say, though, and I think this is important, is for most Americans, Canada is not top of mind. Now, I recently heard someone make a humorous statement. They said that's always been good for the Canadian.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I will say that if you are thinking at the subnational level, like the states and even localities and cities, and the way they think of Canada, even with all the rhetoric and what's been going on, is that they see any opportunity, particularly the northern border states, where there's a good economic interaction and a possibility of economic investment of Canadian or the Canadian private sector in the state, or some type of positive benefit that might lead to job creation, they're going to be interested in interacting with Canadians.
So you're suggesting that, Canada shouldn't just be having a conversation with Washington, but 50 conversations.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I point to when I was at the Governors Association, I'm really proud of this. Actually, with your help at IFSD, we were able to get Justin Trudeau to be the first foreign leader to come and speak to the governors. And it was really successful. And what I liked about it was governors of both parties were interested in talking to him, again, for economic development reasons. That was their focus. There weren't other issues they were concerned about. They just thought, hey, are there opportunities for us to interact that for my particular state, I can get business investment from Canadians and perhaps even some job creation. And there may be some win-win economic development activities between the state and Canada.
So demonstrating the interdependence, really important. You're either a customer or supplier in that relationship. How much does the motivation, the understanding at the level of a governor impact the presidency? I know in the past you've talked about this kind of in normal times, but for the Trump administration, do they listen to the governors? Is there a way for that interdependence to kind of bubble up and start to get reflected in a national strategy? Or is it going to only stay local?
That's hard to say. I think it's going to be primarily at the state or local level from an economic development standpoint. We're in a very partisan period, and frankly, we were prior to Trump becoming the president. So I think because of the partisanship, a Democratic administration listens to Democratic governors, and Republican presidents and their administrations listen to Republican governors. So I think that's what will continue to be the case for a while. Again, it's hard to say. Who knows, 3 to 5 years from now, if we're going to have some very significant political changes in the U.S. or not, that might impact that. Hard to say.
I guess your take is this uncertainty is not going away.
Well, exactly. But there's another thing that's really important to also remember. We're talking a lot about, and a lot of people, of course, are across the world, about the Trump administration, the very significant changes in foreign policy and U.S. economic policy internationally that we've been seeing. But besides that, there's so many other things going on technologically. Certainly AI is huge. So I think you're going to see other things beyond U.S. policy that are going to make some real huge transformations. I think it's really important to not only be thinking in political terms, but be thinking about all these other things that may be transforming the relationships of Canada, U.S., and others, and how to navigate this really interesting transformative period.
And the Canadian government had a very clear strategy to diversify trade and find other trading partners. But in some ways easier said than done, right? Like you talked about the relationship that these governors understand they have with Canada and Canadian provinces. That rewiring, it's not quick, right? Like these are relationships and business interests and integrated supply chains. And no matter what happens in the United States, no matter what Canada tries, I imagine we're in for something that really speaks to a long-term strategy for Canadians.
I would agree. And I think that's really what's important to be thinking about right now. As they say, we can't have the world the way we want it. We have to deal with it the way it is. And I agree. I mean, the best way is to have to navigate short-term issues, but to really focus on what's the best way to get through to the next 3 to 5 years. And whether it's government or business, how do we plan for that and kind of day to day be thinking about 3 to 5 years out?
Scott, always great to have you here in Ottawa at the IFSD. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Today.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a great conversation with Scott. And like after hearing just how intense tax competition could be in certain states, I think it's important for us to kind of turn inward ourselves and how, what does it look like in Canada, both at the federal and the provincial level. So here we've known Heather for many years, and she's currently the founding CEO of the Canadian Tax Observatory, but she has, over 3 decades of experience as a journalist and a bureau chief. That's where we really met Heather. She wrote for the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Canadian Press, and she's led economic policy discussions as a columnist. She's certainly somebody, like if you're having a roundtable discussion and you want to understand an issue, she's somebody that you want to have at the table.
Heather's actually somebody who's reached out to us when we were in the Parliamentary Budget Office, but one of the few journalists that brought their own spreadsheets and models that she'd been developing to compare notes. Doesn't happen often, but it really was impressive. Kevin, I had a very good discussion with Heather, and part of the focus was on the politics of taxation. Why it's so difficult to talk about it, but why it's always such a key issue in the minds of Canadians and voters. And how we end up having these really one-dimensional discussions on competitiveness internationally, in particular with the United States, and why we end up having these discussions about military spending, social safety net, but always in a silo, never about what it costs to pay for these and what the trade-offs might be. So absolutely kind of fascinating discussion with Heather that really kind of delved into these issues. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Former clerk of the Privy Council office, Alex Himmelfarb, had a book. The title was Tax is Not a 4-Letter Word, but is it in politics? In your long history being a columnist, a reporter, and now an analyst in taxation, has it become a 4-letter word of politics?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's a whole toxicity around the tax debate that we have in Canada. We can talk about taxes, but we only like to talk about taxes if they're going one way, which is down. We saw that in the last federal election. Pierre Poilievre went out and promised a tax cut. And then quite soon after, Mark Carney also went out and proposed a competing tax cut. And he's trimmed taxes a couple of times since then as well. And that seems to be the only conversation that we have out there. And, that may feel good in the immediate term, but there's it's just toxic when you go and start talking about, well, maybe we don't have the right mix here, or maybe we're not taxing the right things, or maybe taxes should go up or look different. So the conversation just goes one way. I mean, one thing I've discovered in the world of tax policy is that everybody has an opinion on taxes. Everybody feels very strongly about taxes at a personal level, and they all think that they should go down. But clearly, at a macro level, that just doesn't work.
So how do you think we got here?
I think it's partly to do with the polarity that we see in our politics. There's always an appeal towards the individual. We've seen that over quite a few election cycles where, politicians are constantly trying to talk about pocketbook issues or affordability, and that whole that framework. There's nothing wrong with that frame, and there's nothing wrong with those words, but what it does for a politician is it gives them the ability to talk about what it means to the individual person in their household. And then we lose that whole conversation about what taxes mean in terms of not just paying for social programs, but also, bringing in revenue to keep the macroeconomy stable. Taxes, they play many roles. We can use them as to really steer the direction of the economy in certain ways, and we never talk about that macro picture. I think partly because our political discourse is so focused on that household individual.
Haven't politicians failed at demonstrating the link between the taxes we pay, the services we get, the stability we enjoy, the prosperity that benefits this and future generations?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we rarely have that conversation talking about what we value and how are we going to pay for it? The whole debate right now and over the past year about what are we going to do about defense in Canada, and there seems to be, for the first time in my life watching politics, consensus that we've got to spend more money on defense. But what about how are we going to actually pay for that? So, we have a very disjointed conversation about the things that we want and the things that we expect government to pay for, and then where that money actually comes from. And that's really unfortunate because, there's several consequences. One is, okay, you run up deficits, but the other is you undermine your institutions and that the basis of democracy. If you don't have a strong, solid, healthy conversation between the public service and the government and the people and the companies that pay taxes, on the other hand, then you lose that willingness and that trust between everybody to, okay, the people who pay taxes and the companies that pay taxes trust the government to go and spend the money in a way that's going to benefit everybody. Without that trust, you really do take a chip out of democracy.
Your argument is that we don't allow for the full conversation, right? It's a one-dimensional, can we lower this? But your point about, well, we want to, there's a consensus about spending more on defense. Where does the money come from? Why don't we have that discussion? So we can lower taxes. Yes, we have a defense problem. We've had an Indigenous reconciliation problem. There are all kinds of issues that we genuinely want to deal with. Mm-hmm. Why can't we have the discussion of how it gets paid?
Yeah, I think, the well has been poisoned over the last few election cycles. I think, going back to, the GST, right? Like no politician is going to go out there and talk about raising the GST. It only goes in one direction. Or no politician is going to go out there and even talk about, okay, is the GST the right way, the right design, or, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Because the GST was the subject of an election where, it was make it or break it. And so the stakes became so high that people just stayed away from that whole conversation. But we saw it again, for example, just over a year ago now, when Chrystia Freeland, when she was the finance minister, wanted to raise the inclusion rate for capital gains over a certain amount. And she went out there and proposed this thing and just got hammered right away by the people who would be hit by it. And that just, they did that so effectively. And there was nobody really on the other side speaking up in at least not in a very loud way to actually have a full discussion around there. And then the whole thing just went away. And can we ever talk about capital gains again? I'm not sure.
If we kind of think about the taxation discussion, you can't have it also without thinking about fairness, mm-hmm. right? Like, and we have an intergenerational equity issue right now, right? And how much does this generation, the current generation, want to kick the can down the road, not raise taxes, and just leave these problems for the future generation to solve? Mm-hmm. Like, when does taxation become part of that discussion? That we're just not willing to confront some of our problems and pay for them, so we're just make sure our kids do it.
Yeah, I would hope that we have that discussion before we run into huge problems with deficits. We're not there right now. Canada's fiscal standing is okay, but you would hope that we wouldn't just let it go and as you say, kick the can down the road until somebody else is stuck with the bill for what we have.
But for carbon tax, so effectively, that as an instrument, it died.
I think it comes back to that issue of trust. Mark Carney, when he officially canceled that carbon tax, it was a bit surprising to me that he would go there because, he had made his name in the past through, carbon pricing and climate initiatives and so forth. And that he was the one who actually officially canceled that carbon tax. But his reason was that people had not been persuaded that this was a good thing. And there's something to that, right? That I think what he's getting at is that the trust hadn't been built there for people to see. They didn't see the equation, right? They didn't see the value of what they were doing and the climate, but they also didn't really understand that at least not on a daily basis, that the money was going back in their accounts in another way. So that's on communicators and having a good solid conversation. If you want to do a tax like that, that's not really obvious and in your face about what kind of return you're going to get, then you've got to do a better job talking about public policy.
But it sounds like we can have the discussion on social license, on infrastructure, on pipelines, and we can talk to First Nations and communities and other stakeholders about those and genuinely want to get the social license to do something. Why can't we do that with tax?
I wouldn't say we never can, because there are some instances when we can. Property tax, for example, at the municipal level, it does sometimes go up. and the different kinds of taxes that come in through the back door, and they kind of kick around for a while. There is, I think, if you put a concerted effort into it, there are ways to look at taxation and change those ways. And also, I think it's worth looking at the United States. They have a different approach. We hear the president and a lot of loud voices about cutting taxes and low taxes and so forth.
Right.
But actually, they also have regularly, they have, referendums on whether or not they should increase the tax here, increase the tax there. They're having a wealth tax discussion right now in California and New York City, of all places. And those are acceptable conversations to have in their political culture. So, I have some hope that we can actually start to have a more well-rounded conversation about where we're heading on our tax policy. I mean, I'm sure you share my frustration about the dryness of the conversation around fiscal policy.
We think it's really exciting at the IFSD. So I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm not talking about this room. I mean, our conversation is warm and vibrant. However, it'd be great if a lot more people joined in and understood what was actually at stake.
Like we have one viewer. We know that's about it right now. I guess from a public finance view, we look at it also in terms, like you do, as institutional trust. So if Canadians don't trust their governments to spend their money well, and in public finance, we call that operating efficiency, delivery, and effective and efficient delivery of services. If there isn't confidence, a couple of things happen. One is politicians are very reluctant to raise taxes. The second thing we find is we get these kind of alternative instruments to raise money. So we will find user fees, right? And again, taxes by another name, maybe hitting the individual rather than society as a whole. We lose certain benefits when we do that. We also look at other instruments like public-private partnerships. So we say, okay, we will pay more in our financing costs in order to have the private sector pick up some of these. And we say, because we're going to, transfer risk, which doesn't always seem to happen. Most of these infrastructure projects they're mostly public good, very little commercial interest. They can't make money, and we just can't tax people for them. So we're going to twist ourselves into pretzels to avoid it by charging every other way possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it means that over time, our public services erode, right? Because we're constantly trying to not fund them because they don't want to go and raise the money, right? So we see severe strain in our healthcare system. We see strain in our and crumbling infrastructure as a result of not reinvesting and not being willing to have that conversation. So it's not something that can continue on forever. And I think, it takes some leadership and it takes some guts to go out there and actually say, okay, like if you want these things and you want them to improve, there's a cost. How are we going to do that? And let's have that conversation. I think there's a moment here actually, because obviously Canada is under a lot of pressure internationally. We're dealing with, a long list of problems from the United States mainly, but also, there are a few things happening there. But, we've had this kind of epiphany of nationalism and build Canada and Canada strong and so forth, right? And everything's Canada. But maybe we're getting to, and I would hope we're getting to a moment where we can have a full-blown conversation around what actually it means to have a stronger country and to have a more resilient country and to have, not just a few numbers on a page saying we're paying our share in defense or we want to export here and want to export there, but actually build up our competitive edge and build up our workforce and make sure that we are as strong as we possibly can be, including ways to pay for that and the ways for government to work hand in hand with the workforce and with business to actually do that. Maybe it's a pipe dream, but I'm going to go with it.
I mean, what a good time to have that conversation. But how do we have that conversation? I don't think we have it without people throwing in, well, how do we compare to the United States on corporate taxes, on personal taxes, right? And we have the risk of a whole class of professional seeking greener pastures in the United States for lower personal tax. Companies always asking for lower taxation. And we could sit in a very competitive spot among OECD countries or G7 countries, but somehow, and probably for some good reasons, the comparison is, but the Americans.
Okay, but But, right? Let's look at, so the Tax Foundation, which is an American
go-to source for the stuff. Yeah.
Yes, it is. They rank Canada higher in competitiveness than the U.S.
Okay,
A couple notches.
And this is where I think I want to talk about, because I was going to ask you the question. You answered it. Where do you go? Where does Heather Schofield go to figure out how we line up all these kind of complex charges, direct taxation, indirect taxation, consumption, user fees, and start to have this kind of a level playing field that allows us to compare? Tell us about the Tax Foundation and why that's important.
Well, so first of all, my preface to that is not everything is about tax, even though, I'm from the Canadian Tax Observatory and everything in my world is about tax. But in the broader world, there are other factors, which I'll get to. But just on tax. So Canada is notorious for having high personal income tax. But we have lower taxes in other areas. And so if you take the entire bundle, and that's what the Tax Foundation does around the world, and we come out better than the United States. And there are other countries that we're in the top third, I believe, but it's better. We're better than them. So, if we want to talk about the tax mix, okay, fine, let's have that discussion. But tax overall, the burden overall, we're not doing so badly. And I think that when we have this bitter discussion that it's been following me my entire life. Of corporations say, okay, we have to cut tax to keep ahead of them, and we have to cut tax if we're going to be more productive. Okay, we have cut tax, we have cut corporate tax, and where's the productivity as a result?
Right.
And at what point do we just say, okay, maybe there's more to this than tax? We have some things going for us than just pure dollars and cents. Maybe we have a really great workforce. Maybe we have lots of natural resources. Maybe we're calm and stable and rational and aren't going to go throwing around tariffs and lose our minds at things that might not exist. We don't do that. Those are actually also competitive advantages, especially in today's world.
But even on the effective tax rates in Canada, we've been competitive. We've had aggressive moves all the way back to the Paul Martin government, post-program review, to put Canada in an advantageous spot, particularly with respect to the United States. What happened?
Well, we have a lot of cross-border trade, a lot of cross-border investment. We have a lot of companies that work on both sides of the border. I mean, there was integration, and we have had prosperity. Overall, we're at a point now, though, where our productivity is behind theirs. It's not so bad compared to the rest of the world. I mean, these numbers well. I mean, we do okay. We just aren't on fire like they are south of the border. And I think we've got to look at what's happening with that extra money that came as a result of two things, like lower corporate taxes, but also our companies, they've had high profits. And what are they doing with that extra money? Are they sitting on it and handing it to shareholders? Are they reinvesting it for?
We're not seeing it in the R&D numbers. We're not seeing it in plant, property, equipment investments.
So maybe the answer to our productivity issue and our competitiveness issue is not just slashing corporate taxes, but it's looking at the tax system to see what can be done to push and incentivize productive investment. Like there are all sorts of. I mean, people talk about business investment being the source of productivity, but I really don't think business investment, not all business investment is equal. You can just buy and sell things and nothing is produced as a result except for bank fees. Or you can invest in new things and new ideas. And, I think there's a huge difference in between those things. And our tax system with the right design and the right kind of balance could be a partner in that kind of progress.
I know you've looked at this issue for a long time, and with the Business Council, the risk of flight of our companies and our talent. How real is it? How's it changed over time? And is tax the only factor here? Because we've had mobility for people seeking greener pastures, bigger market, bigger opportunities for as long. I spent half a dozen years in the United States myself, right? And it's just there are certain things you can do there that we just don't have the scale here in Canada to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a giant country with a huge, flourishing, very dynamic economy. So, of course, it's attractive. Of course it is. And I mean, that's a fact of life in Canada and always will be. I think tax is one factor. I don't think it's the factor that lures companies or people down there. And especially right now, okay, we're dealing with all these very unpredictable climate. So if you're a company trying to figure out where you're going to put your next investment dollar, you're going to make the call based on how you're reading those tea leaves, right? If you're doing a lot of cross-border trade and investment, then is it better to stay here and expand here, or is it better to go down there? And that's based on politics. That's not based on tax rates. That's based on, okay, how do you read what Donald Trump is going to do next, or how do you read what whether the rest of the world is going to be able to get your goods or your services without some kind of extra, tariff or fee on top of it. Canada, one of Canada's advantages or competitive advantages over the years has been access to the U.S. market. So, okay, that's not exactly on the table right now. It's not off the table, but
Right.
it's
likely to change.
It's a convoluted picture, right? So where else are we going to find our competitive advantage? And how does tax play into it? Can you see a lower corporate tax rate, for example, changing that calculus for a company trying to figure out where its next dollar is going to go to? I don't think it would. Perhaps on the personal income tax side, if you're, looking at Silicon Valley compared to one of the tech hubs in Canada, Silicon Valley offers, some of the biggest and brightest minds and companies in the world, right? So if we have higher personal income taxes in Canada compared to what do they do in the United States, is that going to change what the allure of Silicon Valley? I don't think so. So, there can be, at an individual level, you're going to calculate, okay, where are you going to get the higher salary? Where's your bigger take-home pay? And tax is part of that calculation for sure. But there's also the whole fact that it's just a really big, vibrant country.
And Heather, maybe the irony is also, I spent my time in New York City, not a great tax jurisdiction, not a low tax jurisdiction, right?
Right. And now they're talking, their new mayor is talking about imposing wealth taxes, which is something where we can't mention that in Canada. Right. So it's
well, you just did. And so I think we opened with a little bit of this issue of intergenerational equity that keeps coming up. We've got a young population in Canada that's probably rightfully looking at their future and saying, I'm not sure I'm going to do better than my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got, a boomer generation right now that's deciding that, in some cases that maybe we're going to take some problems and kick them down the road because, we don't want to deal with them. And taxes are one way to to deal with things, right? How do we think about taxation and wealth distribution on an intergenerational basis? Because it's something that it seems like we can have a discussion about this disparity among generations, but we can't talk about tax as part of that solution.
So I think the key to your question is your focus on wealth. I've been looking at wealth numbers recently. We don't have great data and understanding of where the wealth is in Canada and who has it and what they're doing with it. I hope that will change. But we do know that with tax, we've done an okay job on the personal income tax side at redistributing income. But we don't look at it that way in terms of wealth, and that's where people are getting richer and richer. Wealth begets wealth, especially since the days of the pandemic when financial markets have just been on fire, right? So we see anybody that had a cushion and invested in the markets or had some kind of assets that kind of, they've been doing very, very well. It's a joyride for sure, right? Markets up, markets down, but there's enough of a buffer there in their holdings that they can ride it out. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you're just relying on your wages to get through or government supports, you're not accumulating assets, and you're not able to take advantage of that. And so, over the long term, that older generation that has built up, not just a house, but has a whole bunch of other assets as well. And then they're passing it down to the next generation. That it just compounds that whole system of privilege, and there's a whole bunch of people that are compounding it in the other direction too.
So, and let's get into some specifics. So we don't have gift taxes,
Right.
We don't have capital gains on principal residences, right?
Mhm.
We still have trust vehicles and things that defer taxation. What these are things that allow wealth to be transferred from one generation to another. And there's a class in Canada that has accumulated assets, right? Since in this last run up, it's been a good 20-year run,
Mhm.
particularly on real property. So is that a target? Is that in your mind one of the places where intergenerational equity can be improved?
Perhaps. I mean, so I feel like you're dancing around a little bit around talk of an inheritance tax, and we don't have one of those in Canada, but we do have other ways, right? Which goes back to our
We have a deemed disposition on death to begin with, so it does
right.
get the gains get
Exactly.
crystallized, CRA gets paid,
Yep.
so it isn't as if it's just growing without with an infinite deferral, right?
Exactly. So yeah, when somebody dies, when a rich person uh, dies and they've willed all their assets to their children, say the government assumes that they've been sold and takes capital gains tax off of that. And so there is, it's not just like a gift. There is as you say, CRA gets a piece. But, I think we should be looking at all those deferrals, that the deferral systems that are set up in a whole bunch of different vehicles. And we should also be looking at, how the capital gains is used in between generations, and the ability to just keep accumulating assets within the same family. Like, as you mentioned, there are a whole bunch of exemptions, there are a whole bunch of loopholes, and yeah, maybe we should be looking at those, especially if the if the way you get rich is through wealth and owning assets. And I think, yeah, we've got to take a very thorough look at that, figure out where people are putting their assets, and how they're taxed, and figure out if that's actually a fair way to go that would keep us, keep the prosperity that we've enjoyed in the past, keep it going into the future.
So who's going to advance that politically? And I think addressing some of these issues, I largely spin the NDP. We see some parts of the Liberal Party bring it up. It goes to convention, might even pass a convention, then dies a quick death right after. But how does that get be made part of the dialogue?
So I think it goes back to how we started here. I mean, this doesn't have to be a conversation of taxes up, taxes down. Maybe it has to be a question about taxes differently. So if we look at wealth and say, okay, the goal is to figure out how people can build up their wealth, then maybe it's not a question of just taxing wealthy. Maybe it's a question of using the tax system to incentivize the building of wealth if you have none, or if you have very little. Like, if you are a newcomer to Canada, how are you going to build up your wealth all the time over time? How are you going to accumulate assets? You come with very little, and your goal is to have enough to be comfortable. How are you going to do that, and how can the tax system help you? That conversation is side by side with the sovereignty pro Canada conversation. Like, that would help our productivity if there were actually a whole bunch of people doing that thing, building up great businesses, and that is not exactly an NDP argument. I don't know if they would be against it, but I can see a conservative being as in favor of that as anyone else.
And as a citizen, I mean, we know that there's a consequence to income inequality persisting, right? It has created a class-wide anxiety in the United States that has manifested itself politically in a really kind of risky way. So ignoring it also doesn't seem to be an answer here, right? And I don't think it could be just the domain of progressive parties to advance it. But in the tax community, do we have a lot of spokespeople that don't have an angle behind them when we talk about tax? Because if you think about it, in public policy, you can get a full spectrum of discussions. Do we really get that? I cited my old boss, clerk of the Privy Council, Alex Himmelfarb. He took a real, left of center view with his book on taxation. We don't get that often. Are we missing the broad dialogue in taxation in Canada?
Well, I think so. I mean, that's why we had the Canadian Tax Observatory.
That was kind of a lead in. Yeah, no, there was you walk right through. Excellent.
Yeah. I don't want to say that there's no conversation out there about how to tax differently. You know, I've been able to, since focusing on this, since this, I mean, the think tank is brand new. It's just been since September. You know, I've been finding new and interesting sources of information and you know, people that I can talk to all over the place. So there are, you know, other think tanks that wade into this, and but you know, some of the main voices on taxation are also quite ideological. So yeah, I mean, that's why the Canadian Tax Observatory was set up to fill that void, I hope, to have a conversation and think hard about policy that can actually set us up well for the future. And it's not just about taxes up, taxes down. It's about how to actually use the tax system for everything that we forget about so much. You know, like the tax system to pay for things, yes, but also to encourage certain activities and also to pay for and deliver our social safety net. Those are things that, you know, make Canada great. But yeah, let's not lose that just because we don't want to have a conversation that might be uncomfortable for some people.
So maybe that takes us to the issue of reform, right? And reform isn't always about, do we tax more, do we tax less? We have about 150 billion in tax expenditures that go on every year, all these tax credits that introduce distortions in household spending, in sectors of the economy. We don't really have a look at that in any kind of systematic way, right? Like, when was the last major commission to look at this? How far back do we have to go?
Well, we have to go to the 70s, but there was a kind of a half-hearted reform in the 80s too, and then we had the GST. But you know, I think in more recent history, if we look at what happened to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau, he tried to look at those tax expenditures and change some things, especially for small business. He just got hammered and was so weakened politically that I think it you know, paved the way for him to eventually leave government. There were other things for sure, but anyway, that certainly didn't help. And that experience was scarring for the Liberals. But I think it also tells us something about you know, this whole, there are a lot of theorists out there and economists that would like to do this the grand bargain or big bang,
Right.
And overhaul everything all at once. So there's something very attractive about that, in that, you know, you can think of all the people who are interested in tax getting together in a room and doing a bunch of horse trading and coming out with something at the end. But I don't love that idea, to be honest. I think we don't know what we're aiming for when we're doing that. Like, you can get all those people in the room, but what do they want? Are they actually coherent on what they're aiming for, or are they just interested in the horse trading? But also, to go back to where we started with the toxicity, I mean, can you imagine a politician going out there and saying, okay, our consumption taxes are not high enough, and we've got a system that's unbalanced, so we're gonna raise GST like massively. No, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do that. So I think we've got a lot of hard questions to answer about tax expenditures and loopholes and so forth, about, you know, what's worth it and what's not. And we should absolutely go about looking at those things. I plan to do that one by one. But to put them all together in a pot and stir it up and hope that we come up with something that looks pretty at the end of the day, I can't see that happening.
I mean, Brian Mulroney probably had to wait 20 years to get credit for what he did, right? Like, there's nothing, I think what you're suggesting is there's nothing politically valuable about doing something, a big bang, and really, when there are so many other issues to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also no harm in starting to tell people that, you know, we could spend your money better. We could have more efficient vehicles to get the right outcomes. And we can think about whether we should be subsidizing directly or using the tax system. And, you know, we saw a big simplification, for example, in child benefit.
Mm-hmm.
That was a political winner. And I don't mean for the Liberals. I mean, if you were trying to get at reducing child poverty, it worked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And, you know, there's one area of consensus everywhere on reforming tax policy, which is in the simplicity area. I mean, our tax code is not simple by any means, and we hear all more and more and more about even regular people having to hire accountants just to file their taxes every single year. Our history of taxation is also a history of politics, right? Every election brings a new promise for this boutique tax or this little measure here, this little measure there, and we never get rid of them. They just layer and layer upon each other. We don't really even have a clear understanding of how they interact. So there is a frustration, I think, across the political spectrum, and even among people who are not the least bit political, of like, okay, things this is just too complicated here, and you've got to wonder, with so many little bits and pieces out there floating around, are those tax incentives even do they work? I mean, if you've got so many of them on your plate and they're so tiny and they are hard to file for, do they even work in terms of changing economic behavior? I would like to know.
Well, just went through, the government just went through a review, and would have been interesting to have tax expenditures, for example, as part of the review, because, it became very tempting for political parties to say, we're actually reducing taxes by introducing a tax credit. But it's just spending by another name. Right? Yeah. It's a foregone revenue. And, I think politicians got away with it. And I think a former speaker even allowed them to go through without a royal recommendation because it looked like it was a reduction in tax.
Yeah.
And it was just a complete misunderstanding. So, and so all of a sudden you have boutique tax credits everywhere. But if a government right now has a majority, if they were to pick one thing to do, is simplifying the way to go in terms of incremental reform. Maybe leave me with this idea. We've had a recent change in the political landscape. Maybe this government might have a little more runway than it thought it did when it first got elected. If you look at this kind of menu of options in the world of taxation, what do they try to tackle that has a political value to them and a real value to Canadians?
They're focused on boosting the country's productivity and competitiveness. I would look very hard at what the tax system can do at the level of the regular person, because that's part of the conversation that they seem to forget about too. I mean, they talk a lot about building big projects and talking to big companies, but what about all those people in Canada that are just actually willing to sign up for that project, but are not really included in policy? So let's look at tax policy that can encourage the very regular person to go out there and invest in their own productivity through skills, through training, through starting a little business and building it up and adding to our growth that way. It's complicated for sure. How do you do that? You start also by looking at measuring wealth and figuring out how you tax that and making sure it's efficient.
Well, certainly a role for civil society to kind of help governments tackle this. If they're not going to want to do it, maybe that's the opportunity for you and your organization to put this in front of them and challenge them on it.
Yeah, I certainly plan to come up with some very solid proposals and throw them out there and hope that some of it lands.
We'll be watching with a lot of interest. Heather Schofield, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
My pleasure.
All right. Great discussion with Heather Schofield, and the three bald men of public finance are back. We want to thank the listener and viewer who's still with us after all this time. We're going to now kind of have our normal kind of freeform discussion of what we just saw and heard with Heather and Scott. Kevin, impressions?
Well, first of all, I'm proud to be bald. It's in the spirit of full transparency. One, I think, very interesting conversation. I think it's important for us to understand like what is going on in the United States. How do we compare? Like, what are the problems of comparing? But also, I think we need to shift the conversation as to what are the consequences. And I think just if we could right now, let's just pause and think about where is Prime Minister Carney with respect to the hinge moment in tax policy. And I would say it looks a bit more Trudeau-esque at this point in time, where he hasn't launched big, bold structural reform. It looks very much more kind of very targeted, investment focused, to kind of strategic sectors. We're seeing a lot more complexity added to the tax system, through these investment tax credits, through modernization of the SURE credit, through the, these, very fast depreciation write-offs on investments. So it's very, very investment focused. I think that the difference perhaps is with respect to the affordability issue. I think Canada, I think in other countries, they just found it like they had to respond to affordability. So we saw the lower rate in terms of personal income tax. We saw an increase to the GST credit. We saw a pause with respect to excise taxes on fuel, which are expensive. And I think, the government probably felt like there was no choice. And I think there probably was political support. But the Prime Minister Carney has not launched broad sort of structural policy thinking on taxes at this stage.
So, Moustapha, I'll ask you, and both of you, have we ever seen a big reform happen outside of a majority government?
No, this is an issue because I think reforms normally essentially mean that higher taxes or lower taxes, however you're going to go with it. Lower taxation through a reform has to be at a time where politically it is feasible to do. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. We have seen the most recent significant changes in our tax system when Minister Martin suggested a significant change in income tax system. But that was the time that we had a surplus and the government was not really under pressure. So it is important to take that into account, that when people talk about tax reform, it has to be in the political context, and what is feasible, what is possible.
And Kevin, when as Moustapha notes, when you say we want tax reform, most people read that as lower taxes, right? And why is that? Well, maybe we talk about the competitiveness issue. It's very hard to talk about taxation in Canada without talking about tax levels in the United States, right? And I think both Scott and Heather highlighted that as obvious comparisons politically. But what does it take to have Canadians better connected to the requirements to fund our priorities and what that means for taxation levels in this country?
Well, it probably takes a lot of things. I think one of the things it's going to take is we're going to have we need honesty from the government in terms of spending that is linked to the hinge moment. And we've seen increases in the deficit to fund the hinge moment, to support capital investment, to support trade diversification, to support this sort of increase in defense spending towards NATO targets. There still is a very large funding gap with respect to to NATO. So we're going to have to raise revenues, and we haven't had that honest discussion yet about raising revenues. We've been cutting taxes, and when we know from a fiscal sustainability perspective, as we go out. And if we want to have debt levels relative to GDP that are lower now, we're going to need more revenues. And I think the other thing that's, it's been an ongoing issue. We just keep every budget, every update, we add more tax credits. And so I think the tax system is getting very complicated.
Stefan, maybe a quick comment on the tax credits. I know there's a lot of confusion. I think there's some people that, particularly parliamentarians, have kind of treated them like they're reductions, which they are not. Maybe you could just quickly explain what a tax credit, tax expenditure is relative to a regular cut.
Yeah, taxation has two objectives. One is to raise revenues. The other one is to change people's incentives in terms of how they make decisions. I think we'll definitely need taxation to raise revenues for the government to operate. But on the other side, a lot of these tax deduction or exemptions or credits, these are essentially to change people's behavior or businesses' behavior. We do, for example, these things to bring people in, provide incentive for them to invest in Canada because our taxation will go down. That's really the purpose of it. Or the carbon tax, for example, is a good example. The carbon tax was not a revenue-generating system. It was just to change people's behavior in terms of how much they use fossil fuel. So, but it's not there anymore. But again, these are the sort of the kind of things you need to be considered. So the composition of the tax system, including the exemptions and those credits, are all important. And this is where we really need a major study of the taxation in Canada, just to see whether these things need to be changed now. We haven't had that for many years.
And Kevin, just to bring it back to kind of the way the government collects and spends money, overall spending is, north of $500 billion. But tax expenditures are actually pretty significant.
They don't actually add them all up, Sarah, but I think you're looking at probably something in the neighborhood of $150 billion.
That has to be part of the discussion, right? Because these are programs that you could probably run out of ESDC or one of the departments rather than doing it through the tax code. but it's also low cost. What are some of the downsides maybe of using a tax credit approach to reach people?
Well, I think one downside is you don't get a lot of transparency, and it's only more recently we've seen sort of systematic reviews of these tax expenditures. Are they working? And I think there is some commitment to review tax expenditures now. I think it started under Prime Minister Trudeau. It's continuing under Prime Minister Carney. We see some of these evaluations released on tax expenditures with the release of the tax expenditure tables. But I think, it's just a lack of transparency. And I know, people are looking at even some of these clean energy credits. What's the take up as an example? Or, how are these sure credits, these science research types of credits, are they working? Are they leading to more investment or not?
Let me ask you a question, Sahir. This is your area of expertise at business. How do businesses make decisions about investment and location of their investment and the property, those kinds of things? What's the most important factor in their decision making?
I'm not a fan of taxes. No, I was going to go with Magic 8 Ball as the deciding factor. I think tax is one, and this actually goes into the discussion I had with Scott Pattison. Companies choose to locate their businesses for a number of factors. Concentration of talent. Capital, less of a barrier to entry now. Capital is really mobile, but you often want to have kind of a critical mass of people of expertise. Silicon Valley is a really good example. There are other clusters, say for technology, and Wall Street's a great example of concentration of finance, of capital, but a lot of it centers around where people are aggregating. I had talked to Scott about what has alienated people, and he said, you'll see some billionaires move. He said that kind of movement happens anyway. You'll see people leave Canada because they can pay lower taxes in the United States. He said that's going to happen anyway. But I guess his advice was, as a country, find your value proposition more fundamentally. What are you striving for? You're striving for, quality of life. The economic dimensions are a really important part of it, not the whole thing. You want reasonable distribution of wealth because, they're struggling in the United States with a lot of political angst, which is, he points out, is linked to income inequality, and watching one segment of society really benefit. And the tax code's part of that, and getting more favorable to that kind of top tranche of income earners. So you've got to ask yourself the more fundamental question of what kind of society do you want? That being said, I think we have to make sure that there are incentives to invest, to keep get your money off the sidelines. I think we have really high expectations as Canadians on how the government spends our money in terms of performance. And so that's why I think, when governments say, hey, we want to tax more, there's a lot of reluctance, right? And we end up finding these other instruments like public-private partnerships. My view is that we simply do that because governments aren't comfortable raising taxes. They don't have enough public trust to do it. So I think tax is part of that investment package. I think capital is mobile. We have to be competitive, but it can't be a race to the bottom. And I think that's what Scott was highlighting. Just it's not a sustainable business model. You will not attract talent if you're going to a state with no taxes that also happens to have very little infrastructure. The school system, the healthcare system isn't up to snuff. And so these are things where I think Canada could excel, but we do have to do better. If we're going to close the gap in confidence, we can't do very much with taxation until we do that.
It is interesting. I was looking at the tax competitiveness index, which includes all kinds of taxes. All the G7 countries are actually less competitive than Canada when you consider all the taxes together, income tax, corporate tax. It's interesting to see that number, that ranking.
But do you think, Mustafa or Sahir, that because of the Carney agenda, because the Carney agenda is very much about mobilizing, catalyzing private capital, notwithstanding our current ranking internationally, is there an expectation that certain taxes have to come down?
Well, again, going back to the question that I asked Sahir, that is this really the only factor or the most important factor that provides enough incentive for companies to come and invest in Canada? Or there are other things, which Sahir mentioned some of them, the cluster, the other issues, the availability of resources, availability of
quality of infrastructure, educated population.
Quality of infrastructure, all those things. So I'm not 100% sure that if we reduce our corporate taxes by another 2 or 3 percentage points, this is going to make a huge change in Canada. A lot of people are going to jump on the opportunity to come in. because there are other issues there that we have to.
And Mustafa, you made this point earlier, like prior to the big drops and headline kind of corporate tax rates, we were quite competitive. The Martin government enacted some really significant tax cuts in a good fiscal situation, but Canada was ahead of the United States in some of the key measures. It didn't kind of result in a windfall economically for Canada, and it leads you to believe that there are other factors, and not that was a poor decision by any means. I think we do have to be competitive, but clearly it wasn't the only factor, or I think we would have seen much more capital pour in. And Scott was really clear. A number of states have no income tax, and it's actually not a panacea. It's not the silver bullet for attracting business, because he explained that companies don't always want to move there. The executives don't want to be in a jurisdiction where they don't feel like they have the infrastructure, where they have education, healthcare, all those other attributes to good quality of life that matter. So he said it can't just be that. And he said we'll see California and New York probably have a few very high profile departures, but in the end they're going to get back to focusing on what they're good at, which is innovation, excellence, which really relies on attracting and keeping good human capital, right? So, the lesson for Canada from Scott was, again, know your value proposition, make sure your public, your citizens are well-educated, well-equipped, skilled, not just educated from a university point of view, but well-skilled to deal with some huge disruptions that are coming, with AI, essentially another wave of automation, and foreign competition that the likes of which we haven't seen in a while. So, I think from a policy point of view, you said, figure out how you want to present yourself to the world, be good marketers, but make sure that you're well-rounded. I don't think we can win a race to the bottom. I think his point was we probably don't want to even try.
One other thing that you mentioned, Kevin, I just wanted to raise this again. And you mentioned that definitely we need higher taxes. We need higher revenue.
Yeah.
And I think you're right in a sense that, unfortunately, most Canadians don't really realize when they ask for new services, new help from the government, that it's going to cost money. Yeah. And the money has to come from somewhere. People ask for more services, more enriched social safety nets. All that some of that is necessary. But at the same time, you have to realize that costs money. And that money has to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, that realization is not there.
Yeah.
You talk to average person, they don't really realize that the money, it has to come from taxation.
And Mustafa, I don't even know if it's like average people like us, because I think, the discussion I had with Heather, it could be big, business lobbies, big unions. Yeah. Everybody asks for something that's of interest to their constituency, and we never have to have the discussion of trade-offs, right? I want to hit this fiscal target, or I want to have this level of investment in defense, or I want to have this social program. And you're left to the black box of political decision-making to figure out who gets how much of what and what are the trade-offs. So we never get to have that proper discussion. And that, I think, is one thing that, Heather Carvalho is preventing us from having that national conversation.
Could you imagine Budget 2026 really launching some version of an independent tax commission of the likes that we probably haven't seen in 60 years?
I think we definitely need that.
Ask you, do you think it'll happen? How do you jump to, I think we need it?
Well, we need it. Whether it will happen or not, this is difficult to say. I mean, the government's focus is not on that right now, but I think we definitely need that. I think at one point, all these different issues about the taxation needs to be studied and reviewed, and then recommendations come from an independent group.
Yeah. And is there politically, like say here, do you think the fact that Prime Minister Carney now has this sort of slim majority, but it's still a majority, does this change the political dynamics of actually having the conversation?
You know what? As much as I think Heather was able to convince me on the need, I still am struck with the fact that it's a conversation that probably nobody wants to have. So I'm left to believe that the government of Mark Carney, is going to want to outrun this expenditure track. I think they're going to want to outgrow it. And I think everything will be on boosting the revenue line, but it will be through economic growth, as much foreign direct investment as they can get. And at some point, probably getting the immigration numbers back in, which we're floating the economy for a while. But I think we're going to have to outrun this thing, because I don't think the politics are there. I don't think the majority is big enough. And, when we've had these opportunities for national conversation on taxation, again, as Mustafa pointed out, we were in a very different fiscal situation.
Can the government actually outrun this question of needing to raise more revenues? And so the Prime Minister sort of set the stage, I think, very effectively in terms of talking about a hinge moment. So the context is set. We need capital investment to boost productivity. We need trade diversification. We've talked about it for decades. Now President Trump makes it that inevitable. We have hot wars, so to speak, in Europe and the Middle East. We need to move towards those NATO targets. So we have a hinge moment. Where do we get to the tipping point, where people can actually see we don't have the revenues? We're going to actually have to do something to our tax system to generate more revenues beyond just, growth. When will we see that? You're the forecaster.
This is yeah.
Don't duck the question.
This is a good question. I think if you put it in the context of fiscal sustainability in the long run, I think we can certainly manage this as long as our borrowing is not getting out of hand in terms of the percent of the GDP that we are borrowing, as long as interest rates remain relatively low in Canada, and we can grow at a reasonable rate. I think we can manage the sustainability over time. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that we should not look at the taxation and the composition of the taxation and everything. I think that is the more long-term issue is in terms of providing the basis and providing environment for Canada to grow more and further in a robust way in the future.
But outrunning it, does it mean in this environment that we just get these positive economic surprises? Is it realistic that we could close some of these fiscal gaps related to national defense?
That would be very hard, to be honest with you, even if we grow. I mean, growing, yes, it will provide more revenues, but for every dollar of GDP, we only get 15 cents of revenue. So you have to see how much GDP should go up for us to close that gap. It's not easy.
That's what, Kevin, I think it puts a focus on what we talked about in another episode, which is the reallocation. So what are you going to cut from the existing base of spending to spend on the new priorities? We had a flavor of that in the first budget and very little discussion of anything since. I think when we did our reaction to the fiscal update, one of our recommendations was this government's going to have to look long and hard at reallocation and start to figure out of the $500 billion that's being spent now, are there opportunities to cut that? And not just beyond, it's got to be beyond the operations of government. I'm going to get really tired of people thinking we can just keep cutting government to get there. Our spending is now past 16% of GDP. The government operations isn't going to get you back to 12, 13% or get you to your NATO target. Other things that we think are really important programs will probably have to be on the table for discussion. So either way, I think this government's going to have some uncomfortable discussions with Canadians about how do you achieve the big, really important hinge moment related policy objectives and do it within a fiscal structure that remains sustainable. This is something, Kevin, I think it's come up, before that, maybe there's a role for civil society, right? This is for nonprofits, think tanks, universities, business groups, coalitions of citizens to have this dialogue that maybe the government can't have on its own. And that's also okay.
Well, I think the wading through these hundreds of tax credits, exemptions, I think is incredibly complicated. And so you're going to need tax experts. But there's another dimension of this conversation about quality of life that I think, means that I think you want parliamentarians, stakeholders that can speak to some of these broader quality of life issues. So don't end up, I think where Mr. Pattison was going, that this race, just the race to the bottom.
That's it for the three bald men. We've got to go. I booked haircuts for all of us. I got a really good discount. Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And we'll look forward to coming to you soon with another episode.
Thanks, Tahir. Thanks, Mustafa.
Thank you.